Hello. So unless you've been living under a rock for the last few months, or at least since I've last updated this YouTube channel, you're aware that there's been a huge increase in prominence of radical movements both on the left and the right. Now, I have been very interested in these radical movements, especially the alt-right, and I've kept an eye on most of their leaders and thinkers on YouTube and elsewhere. Now, recently, one interview really caught my eye as a new and up-and-coming YouTuber, Roaming Millennial, interviewed Richard Spencer, probably the most prominent alt-right leader at large today. Now, I listened to the interview and I found it more or less pretty standard. No one who's ever heard Richard Spencer talk about his ideas will be surprised, and Roaming Millennial was oppositional but very polite, as I've come to expect from her. But more interesting than the interview was the reaction on Twitter, where YouTuber ContraPoints, who I've had on my channel very recently, went on a 2 or 3 hour jag about how atrocious and unconscionable it was that Roaming Millennial had hosted an alt-right speaker, someone who was actually a Nazi. This is an opinion that's taken very seriously in the progressive world, but is really entertained almost nowhere in the skeptic, conservative, or libertarian spheres of thought. It's very common for progressives to talk about deplatforming people, but there haven't been too many live streams where an actual progressive and a conservative libertarian sit down and discuss the relative merits of discussing controversial and radical ideas on the right. And this was one rare opportunity. Now, as a lot of my channel fans have been telling me, I haven't been uploading very recently due to the fact that I've been very busy IRL. And I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to make a quick video, a sort of return to the after-action report format, where we could explore the ideas inside this livestream conversation and really isolate the points being made, especially the idea that deplatforming is necessary, as argued by ContraPoints, which is a very common progressive opinion that is very rarely defended or even examined critically. So without further ado, let's discuss ContraPoints, Roaming Millennial, Richard Spencer, and the need to deplatform. So after listening to the entire 1 hour discussion, I really realized that some background was required from people who might not be familiar with the alt-right or Richard Spencer. The alt-right is a neo-identitarian movement largely focused around white identity politics. In the wake of the dissolution of the neoconservatives and the earlier dissolution of paleoconservative forces, this movement gained new prominence online, specifically through new figures like Spencer and other people who saw themselves as a pushback against similar identity politics movements on the left. Unlike previous white nationalist and white supremacist movements, the alt-right has been very careful to adopt very much the same framework of identity politics as already practiced on the left, officially disavowing violence and most of the unsavory elements of what previously accompanied a lot of these white power and white supremacist movements. This is something that was indeed safe for hipsters, and very safe for young disaffected white people on the internet. Since the election of Donald Trump, the alt-right has been front and center of progressive attempts to deplatform and intimidate opposition. Early in the inauguration, in January and February, the punching of Richard Spencer led to a debate on the left over whether it was right to punch someone who they thought was no different than a Nazi. This followed in the wake of other, broader attempts to deplatform people like Milo Yiannopoulos, Ann Coulter, and Charles Murray, who, while not being alt-right themselves, were considered by progressives to be morally indistinguishable from the alt-right movement. Now, a lot of the progressive calls to deplatform and censor the alt-right have hit a major logical and argumentative snag. Namely, that since Richard Spencer and the other alt-right thinkers have consciously molded their own movements around the identity politics already used on the left, the progressives had very few straws to grasp for when explaining why a person like Richard Spencer should be deplatformed and excluded on universities or really anywhere. If all Richard Spencer is doing is an identity politics for white Americans, already embraced on university for every other race of Americans, there are very few arguments against hearing the man out. But since the left controlled most institutions that would ever entertain platforming figures on the alt-right, this question was, no pun intended, academic. I think this is one of the reasons why ContraPoints' conversation with Roaming Millennial offered such a fruitful opportunity to finally force the left to make its arguments against platforming Spencer and the alt-right in earnest and see how they held up. Now, it was apparent when watching the video that there were really two conversations going on. Sure enough, ContraPoints was making his case against platforming Spencer, but Roaming Millennial was really defending herself on a personal basis. She was defending herself as an op-editor and as a journalist as to why what she did was ethical. And I fully understand this. As a person who very much respects Roaming Millennial and the voice that she brings to the table on YouTube, I think this was more or less necessary. But it did lead to the situation where ContraPoints was making an abstract case, and Roaming Millennial was really only making a personal defense. And for purposes of this video, we are really only interested in the abstract case for deplatforming people like Richard Spencer and the alt-right generally. Therefore, my main focus here is going to be to isolate ContraPoints' arguments by looking at what he is saying and what his reasons are for wanting to deplatform Spencer, and why he's arguing that Roaming Millennial shouldn't have interviewed Spencer or should have interviewed him in a way that was so critical as to basically not give him voice to express his opinions. I'll then try to Iron Man this argument, explain what I think is strong about it, but at the same time why, for myself and pretty much everyone else on the contemporary right or moderate wing of the American political spectrum, we find the case for deplatforming to be so uncompelling, especially when it comes from people in the contemporary left. I really hope that ContraPoints in particular can respond to me, if not with another conversation via livestream, at least with perhaps an email exchange or some tweets. I'd really like to hear what he has to say about this. But without further ado, let's look at ContraPoints' arguments for deplatforming Richard Spencer. Number 1. Spencer is an actual Nazi.
For decades now, the word Nazi has just been kind of thrown around as just a catch-all term for anyone who you think is authoritarian or racist in any way. I completely agree that the word is thrown around recklessly. However, I think that despite that, there are people for whom the word Nazi is actually aptly applied to. This is a man who, despite his eagerness to present this kind of stuff white people like, hipster image, is a guy who seems to be unable to resist the temptation to keep invoking this Nazi stuff. So, and combined with the fact that he believes in a goal of an ethnically homogenous white state, just makes the term Nazi is very apt when applied to him. Despite the fact that the word is abused and misused, there's still good uses for it and uses where it really is accurate. And I think he, of all people, is certainly one of those cases.
2. Spencer is misrepresenting his opinion to make it more appealing, deceptively.
So what I think is different about this case is that in my experience dealing with white nationalists, it's just a big mistake to take what they say at face value. So to me, to have him up here and to sort of assure everyone that, oh, like what I'm saying is not so bad and it's just so unfair that I'm represented as a white supremacist, and you know, I just, all I want is for a homeland for European Americans, and like just like everyone else gets their own homeland. To me, this kind of stuff, because to me, what Richard Spencer is a very skilled public relations man for National Socialism. This is National Socialism with a big yellow happy face smacked on top of it. The direction they want to take things is likely to go very violent, very fast. I think that even that, you know, the kind of happy face version of this has to be put under the most intense scrutiny and criticism. If it's allowed to speak for itself, it's a Trojan horse, is what I'm saying.
3. People are oftentimes swayed by rhetoric as opposed to arguments. And 4. Giving a platform to Nazi rhetoric allows it to spread.
It wasn't necessarily you're giving a platform to hate. In a way, what it is worse, which is a platform for the kind of euphemisms in which hate promotes itself. It's the propaganda, the public relations version of it. Like if in a way, it would be better if you had someone who just came on and was like, I want to kill the Jews, because that person, I think most people can recognize, okay, I don't agree with that. But it's the kind of sneaking in of the idea through this relatable persona and through ideas that seem on the face value potentially reasonable to a lot of people. So again, to me, what's dangerous about it is that I think that Richard Spencer has a talent for presenting these ideas in a way that make them seem like they're sort of within the realm of what could be reasonably discussed, when if you saw what I think is the actual agenda, would be repellent. My academic background is in philosophy. In philosophy, there's this idea called the principle of charity, where what you do is basically you try to interpret your opponent's arguments in the most positive possible light. And this is like, generally, this is the most responsible way to argue, right? It is not to just straw man and try to attribute to them things they don't explicitly say, and so on. But I think that method, though it's the fairest and best way to argue with most people, I think that Richard Spencer and white nationalist rhetoric represents a kind of hijacking of these norms of conversation. They exploit our generosity in a sense to you make these sort of deceptive and dishonest arguments that, to me, I just think you're not accurately assessing the situation if you take it at face value.
And finally, 5. The spread of Nazi rhetoric and ideas will have terrible consequences.
I guess with the Mein Kampf analogy, like, okay, like, there's just no reason to be, in the same way that like you want to like limit the access of disillusioned young Muslim men to radicalizing hate preachers. Like, we don't need to be handing out copies of Mein Kampf to disillusioned young white men. And I mean, the nature of the audience on YouTube, there's just a lot of like, there's a lot of like white guys who are kind of on the fence and sort of like experimenting with being alt-right trolls, and they, don't know exactly where they fit into this. And so handing them like a hour-long speech of Richard Spencer presenting his ideas in the most flattering light, to me, it feels dangerous, because to me, I think some of those guys are going to like what he said. If you think that publishing a book leads to the emergence of totalitarian ideas that could potentially lead to catastrophic wars, genocide, and so on, don't publish that book. I don't think that that's what the concept of free speech entails. I don't think that entails that we have to give a platform to everything. The expression of a thought, for instance, the endorsement of ideas of extreme hate, intolerance, or the sort of euphemistic versions thereof, I think that's an action. And that kind of action also should be opposed. It's an immoral thing to do. I think that publishing Mein Kampf in the 20s or 30s, like, that to me is not just merely thought crime. Like, that's a palpable action that had devastating consequences.
So with some exceptions for the editing in order to make the arguments more coherent, those are ContraPoints' basic arguments for deplatforming people like Richard Spencer, and indeed almost all people on the alt-right. Now, I think put in sharp relief, you can see that there actually is a case here for deplatforming that can be put very succinctly. We might disagree with it. It certainly violates our hard liberal principles. And if you're a libertarian, this is an unconscionable violation of individual liberty. But it nonetheless makes a certain amount of sense. And if you don't believe me, I'll just put it in more general terms, replacing alt-right and Nazi for just generally bad ideas and evil people. There's something you might immediately recognize about this line of arguing. What you might immediately recognize about this line of arguments is that it bears a very, very striking resemblance to previous justifications for censorship. Indeed, throughout much of Western history, this argument was the argument for censorship, both in the original justification for the Catholic Church's syllabus of errors and index of prohibited books, and also later in the modern nation state, where standards of decency and decorum were developed in order to guard the general public against what they saw as perverse ideas that would destroy society. I like to call this the parochial case for censorship, and it's very important to remember in all conversations involving this particular topic that the liberal perspective that we have a marketplace of ideas, and that all ideas need to be platformed and argued against and contested until the right ones naturally come to the top based on how well they're argued. That more modern liberal idea constitutes a very, very particular and very, very rare opinion in human society. For most of human history, and indeed most of Western history, the parochial case of censorship was accepted. And indeed, I understand why, as somebody who made several videos about how arguments are always defeated by narratives, and how people don't really tune into logical arguments for the most part. It is very possible that bad ideas can take hold of large populations and cause a lot of damage if they're not controlled. And bad ideas have devastating consequences. Anybody who doesn't think bad ideology has consequences has obviously not read a history book of the 20th century. And indeed, as somebody deeply sympathetic to the Catholic tradition, I recognize that my own church had justification for a lot of its concerns about dangerous new ideas. I have to admit that, in spite of myself as a modern liberal, the parochial case for censorship has a very, very firm foundation in human history and also a utilitarian justification for its existence. Indeed, I respect a lot of people who say there need to be more controls on ideas. So that being said, why, if someone like ContraPoints or anybody from the left were to come at me with this particular argument, why would I, and indeed most other conservatives, react so negatively to it? React like it was a betrayal, and react like the argument really had no merits on the face of it? And I think to answer this question, I really have to get at the particulars. I don't think that the argument is necessarily prima facie bad or prima facie risible. I think that the particulars of how the left has used this argument in the past, how they've introduced it historically, and how they continue to employ the standard in their own machinations in the culture war, leads to modern conservatives not taking this seriously, and very deservedly condemning this line of argument every time they hear it coming from progressives. Now, usually when I make these videos, there's oftentimes a number of reasons why I think a particular position is wrong. But in this case, there's only one reason why conservatives really dislike this argument for censorship coming from progressives, and that is hypocrisy. But some historical context is needed. The reason why the original parochial standard for censorship was abandoned came from progressives arguing essentially for their case. Now, of course, there was an initial rebellion against parochial censorship in the 19th century post-Enlightenment, but for the most part, most of the battles we have against banning books and late censorship experienced in the 20th century come from arguments had between progressives and Marxists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when these groups felt entirely on the back foot. Then, academics universally argued that despite any type of concern about the moral nature of the work in question, despite the consequences it might have for future society, ideas must be read and argued about, and to do anything else was to betray the principles of liberty that our society was based on. Now, when the shoe's on the other foot, and conservatives have the back foot in these institutions, the doors are now slammed in our face. And I know what ContraPoints and other progressives are going to say. These old censorship standards were all about sex and sexuality, and that's harmless. Well, given the fact that ContraPoints and I have already had an extensive disagreement as to the relative damage of the sexual revolution, he and most progressives are missing the plain historical fact that many of these parochial censorship requirements were directed against the fear of totalitarianism, the same type of murderous totalitarianism that he voices concern for in his conversation with Roaming Millennial. Now, as I said before, I fully understand that Roaming Millennial was really doing a personal defense of her own journalistic ethics, and was not trying to attack the more abstract case. But there is one word that I was listening for, waiting for, because the mere utterance of this one single word would have immediately won her the debate in the abstract and in the personal contention about her decision to interview Richard Spencer. And that one word was communism. If you're in an argument with a progressive over whether we need to deplatform people who have ideas they consider to be Nazi, you should immediately bring up communism. Communism was a murderous movement born straight out of ideology that we can trace to specific thinkers who made their ideas very, very attractive through ambiguous language, through Trojan horses. Yet what progressive would argue that we deplatform communists? Indeed, to go back to the historical context, in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, when these questions came up, the understanding that progressives put forward was that despite the fact that they supported communists, despite the fact that they had ideas that were very similar to communists, they should have the ability to speak and their ideas should be judged on the merits. Their ideas should be judged at face value with no further innuendo being read into their work. Now, in ContraPoints' conversation with Roaming Millennial, he goes on about how in 1936 Hitler didn't say anything different than Richard Spencer was now, implying that indeed people who are trying to promulgate an idea rarely actually come out with their end goals. But by the same measurement, what communists talked about gulags, what communists talked about mass starvations and executions of counter-revolutionaries. If we're going to be attributing works to their ultimate body count, Marx's Communist Manifesto probably killed more than Mein Kampf. But is the decision to circulate that immoral? And again, we return to the historical context, because in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, numerous academics, called to the carpet for their affiliation with the communists, had literally apologized for Stalin while he was committing his worst atrocities. Some of them were even openly supporting Stalin and were partisans of the Communist Party. We were in the middle of a Cold War with one of the most murderous ideologies of all time. An extensive number of left-wing intellectuals supported this murderous ideology, yet time and time and time again, every time the parochial case for censorship was brought up, the conservatives were handed the typical excuse that liberalism forbade any type of intrusion onto free thought, and that any notion that ideas could be read into and looked at critically for their final consequence was a freeway straight to paranoid McCarthyism. These thinkers had deeper ties to Joseph Stalin than Richard Spencer will ever have, even to people who are tangentially connected to modern Nazi parties. And those modern Nazi parties are not committing atrocities currently. And I wonder even what ContraPoints would say with the communist analogy, because I'm fairly sure he wouldn't want us to scour the universities to fire and censor people who are Marxists, which would be the natural consequence of his very argument taken to the extreme. And given how widespread Marxism is in the universities, that would be a massive purge. But alright, maybe I'm not being charitable, because indeed I sort of suspect how ContraPoints would respond to this. I think ContraPoints would say, just like he said when Roaming Millennial brought up radical separatist movements on the left, that the alt-right or white nationalist movements generally posed a much more immediate threat. They could potentially take over the country. This is sort of an extension of the perennial progressive opinion that it's alright when minorities have these kind of objectionable separatist opinions because they can't possibly wield that power. Nothing bad can ever come of it. Now, I know this is probably getting into what really should be a longer video, but I find this objection totally disingenuous and absolutely factually false. We know from history that communist revolutions and communist vanguards, which themselves comprise a minority, frequently can take over countries in revolutionary feats. Moreover, we know from history that genocides and many other ethnic conflicts are driven by minority populations that suddenly come into power and use that momentary vantage point to wreak havoc upon people they see as historically oppressing them. Political power is very, very transitory, and groups that found themselves historically on the out can suddenly come into a great deal of power. Conversely, it is very common for vanguards, and indeed communist vanguards, to seize power during chaotic time periods and make all sorts of uses of that power, usually involving the deaths of millions of people. The idea that somehow the right is particularly close to power in the way that radical left groups are not is ridiculous. It's a reflection only of the individual fears of the progressive themselves. The sensation not that the right is particularly close to power, but their particular aversion to the right wing itself. And ultimately, we end up with a case being made for parochial censorship that is entirely lopsided, that is entirely a reflection of a need to censor a particular brand of political ideas. Which brings me to the final point, the need for a basis for having a parochial case for censorship. Now, classically, the idea of censoring something was done on the basis that society had a moral standard. It had some kind of agreed upon ethos, a religion, a civil ethic. But in the contemporary world, we assert no such moral standard. All we have are political persuasions. All we have are a myriad of different cultures. And there's no mainstream sense of a larger coherent moral system. But without a larger coherent moral system, how could anyone decide on a parochial standard? Well, I think that we know how this is decided in the progressive sphere. It's decided on the basis of political leanings. In particular, it's decided on the basis of highly radicalized political left trying to exclude and censor anything it sees as a potential rival. This idea is a product of a general opinion on the progressive left that anyone who holds right-wing beliefs and anyone who has reactionary positions must be hiding a deep personal evil or personal conflict that can be condemned as almost demonic. And for this example, I look no further than ContraPoints himself. Now, my last conversation with the ContraPoints largely centered around the pickup artist community and the condemnation that feminists like ContraPoints have for them. I couldn't really discern why or by what logic a person who endorsed the sexual revolution of casual and callous sex could really condemn a pickup artist who simply pursued it more earnestly. Ultimately, the argument broke down along the fact that ContraPoints thought that the use of flowery language and the implications of caring demeanor were nefarious when coming from people like Rush V, but not when coming from people inside, say, the gay community or another community of people he had high opinions of. In fact, by the end of the conversation, it became inescapable that the only reason for the condemnation was ContraPoint's assumption that he could peer into the motivations and soul of the people he was critiquing and accurately discern whether they were acting in good faith or not. And largely, in the end, this hinged upon whether they were allied with the political left or right. The gay leftist who pursued casual sex could be assumed to be in good faith, because he was broadly affiliated with the progressive cause, whereas pickup artists, who are broadly reactionary in their political persuasion, have to be assumed to be nefarious at all times, even if the end result was more or less the same. And here we see very similar logic being employed in the case of when we can use parochial standards of censorship to restrict platforms to people we think might have dangerous ideas. We can safely assume that people like Richard Spencer, who have tangential connections to Nazi groups and other totalitarian ideologies on the right, and who have ideas that can only be achieved over an ocean of blood and mountains of corpses, are malfeasant. We can assume this because they have an affinity to a dangerous and radical idea. However, at the same time, a communist who may have direct connections to radical groups involved in all sorts of atrocities, who may well also have opinions and visions of the future that are only achievable over a sea of blood and mountains of corpses, might be evaluated to be benign, and even an idealist. And of course, this has nothing to do with their relationship to reality. This has nothing to do with the likelihood that their ideas will result in actual bloodshed. This has everything to do with their relationship to either the left or right-wing political spectrums, which are decided a priori by people in the progressive movement to be either angelic or demonic. A relationship to the left of the political spectrum naturally aligns somebody a priori to the good, to the righteous, whereas the right is always assumed to be malfeasant and malignant by its very nature. So I hope here I can provide an answer to progressives like ContraPoints why, although I see how their parochial case for restricting speech might have some benefits, I nonetheless condemn it any time I see it come in a contemporary progressive context. The hypocrisy is too high. Moreover, the worldview you're asking to rule the roost and to actually make the divisions between what's acceptable and what's not is something that you would never accept if it were coming from the opposite side of the ideological spectrum. It is an arbitrary standard, devoid of any kind of moral or logical basis, and hinging only on Manichaean concepts of one side eternally being on the righteous right side of history, and the other side always reacting futilely against it. Indeed, I will entertain parochial standards if they're put in some kind of coherent way, based on moral systems that are universally applicable. Name a standard and we can examine it. But that standard will be applied universally, and in the meantime, while I might hire you as a censor, I'm certainly not going to hire you as the diviner of the goodness of men's souls. While I may have mystical opinions, that's certainly an office you can't pretend to. You may have pristine philosophical arguments, but you're still no expert as to the evil that may or may not lurk in the innermost hearts of men.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.